Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar sponsored by Avetta. Just want to let you know that as you file in, you are in the right place. We're going to get things going in about a minute from now. Hello again. Welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webinar sponsored by Avetta, letting you know you're in the right place. We're going to get things going in about 30 seconds. Okay, an official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, Mastering the 5 Core Capacities for Safety Excellence, sponsored by Avetta. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health Magazine and will be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. In a few minutes, we'll start a presentation, but first, let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and may not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not necessarily mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we'll conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speakers. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey. I will let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Shawn Galloway, who serves as CEO of ProAct Safety Incorporated. Shawn is a trusted advisor, professional speaker, and author of several best-selling books on safety strategy, culture, leadership, and employee engagement. He's received awards and recognition from numerous organizations, including the American Society of Safety Professionals and the National Safety Council. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation today. Shawn, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here with you today. The argument I'm going to make in today's discussion is you cannot have safety excellence without business excellence, and you cannot have business excellence without safety excellence. They're hopelessly tied together. The models I'm going to be sharing with you today are found in, excited to say, my most recent book, which is published this week. We're really excited about that. It's available in all formats, so shameless plug, I'm sorry. The models we're going to be talking about today were originally conceived of by Terry Mathis, who is the founder of my firm. He retired in 2021. He brought this together in 2008 as what we called the bridge to excellence. The more we kept finding with organization after organization, hundreds and hundreds of organizations we would introduce this model to help them on their path towards excellence, the more often we found that it's not just a model that can be applied towards safety excellence, it's about how do we achieve excellence and performance that's sustainable in all aspects of our business. But what you'll see is the things that we do to improve safety, if we don't leverage it in other aspects of the organization and the organizational culture, you'll reach a point of diminished returns. But one of the first things I want to start with is challenging around what is excellence? What is safety excellence? A lot of organizations, even still in 2023 today, still define it by 0 injuries, target 0. That's possibly a part of it, but there's so much more to that. But 10 years ago, I had the privilege to deliver the opening keynote for the very first safety conference in the country of Azerbaijan. And as I'm running on the treadmill, looking out over the Caspian Sea, thinking about the international perspective of bringing leaders within this country together for the first time to talk about occupational safety, I landed on my own personal mission that's going to be sprinkled throughout today's discussion. And my personal mission is to continuously challenge the thinking around what is and what isn't excellence in safety. How we've defined safety 10 years ago is antiquated today. Today, how we define safety excellence has changed based on some of the things that are going on around here. But I remember about the same time I was working with an organization that was coming up on 3 years without a recordable injury. They're about to have a celebration, as a lot of companies do. Keep in mind, anytime we reward results, we're reinforcing the performance that led to the results. So whenever we reward an accomplishment like that, make sure it's clear what we've done to arrive at that accomplishment. Coming up on 3 years without a recordable, one day, terrible thing happened. A supervisor is coming down from within the location and he hears a squeaky sound. Based on the union contract, he's not supposed to put his hands on the tools. He's supposed to go get somebody else, delegate the work. Instead, he goes and grabs an oil can, opens an access door, bypassing lockout tagout. To lean in and hear where the sound is coming from, he placed his hand on a metal rod. And when that metal rod moved past some machinery, unfortunately, he lost the 4 fingers in his left hand. And this is when I was engaged by the organization. I've been involved in over a dozen fatality events, not just amputation like this. And most of the time it surprises the organization that they think that they're good. And that's also part of what we're going to be talking about today. But I remember sitting in the room, the president flew in, me and the other managers from the other locations, and he was doing a supervisor stand down. His leadership style is different than my preferred leadership style, but his style was to admonish everyone. So in the supervisor stand down, he brought all the supervisors in. The injured party was still in the hospital at that time, but he's admonishing them, saying things like, don't you know what you're supposed to do? Don't you know what you're not supposed to do? I later wrote a piece about this, and it's in the opening introduction of my book, Coach, A Safety Leadership Fable. I saw this individual, more experienced supervisor, stand up and say to the president of the company, when challenged, don't you know what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do? He challenged with, respectfully, sir, I don't think that has been made clear to us. And I watched the president look over at the row of the other managers and kind of gruff to them, is that true? And if you can see my video feed here, most of the managers responded like this, shrugging their shoulders as to say, I'm not sure. And it started a really interesting conversation within the organization that if we're all not on the same page on what our responsibilities are and how to arrive at a injury-free outcome, don't expect that everyone else is. But despite all the things that organizations have done, one of the other reasons I wrote this book over the last year and a half was some of the concerning themes that I'm seeing. I work across all major industries globally, and I'm seeing some themes that I want to see as I outline what some of these themes are, if you find yourself in any of these, because I find that safety performance is a symptom. It's either a symptom of we're doing the right things, we're getting lucky, or not doing the right things, but it's often a symptom. Think of if you have a headache, you take your preferred medication to try to stop that headache. And if it goes away, you don't think much about it. If the headache persists, that might be a symptom of something larger going on within the human organism. I find very often safety is but a symptom within the organization, that I rarely find organizations that are just excellent at safety, but poor in other areas, or organizations that are poor at safety, very low maturity, but great in other areas of the organization. So it's a symptom. But some of the things that I'm seeing demonstrated to me, the organizations that had the capacity to be great, the bridge that they built, because I want you to think of this model I'm going to introduce you to as your organization. Your organization is a bridge. You as a leader, as an individual contributor, are part of this bridge as well. So we want to be thinking about in this, what do we do to build the capacity for safety excellence, to build the capacity for sustainable performance? But some of the themes that I'm seeing out there, and see if they resonate with you, is that the workplace has changed. We're not going back to how things were pre-COVID. things are different. And some of the things that are different tell me we need to go back. And if we have great performance, really start to investigate why we have great performance. And are we seeing any of these things manifest in our organization? Number one, workplace shortages and decreased expertise. I'm seeing the tenure level decrease, the industrial skills decrease of several people coming into the organization. So in some companies where the knowledge level was deep and wide across the organization, it's a little bit more shallow now and spread thin across the organization. According to Gallup, engagement scores are decreasing. So we have a more disengaged workforce, according to Gallup. The new people, the training isn't as effective as it once was. And in a lot of organizations, I'm finding new people training new people. So it's essentially creating a tribe of not really knowing of what safe is and what risk is. And in those organizations, based on what I mentioned earlier, target zero injuries, they've defined success as the absence of injuries. So these new people are part of creating and changing the culture that thinks as long as you don't get hurt, it must be safe. So the ability to recognize what's safe and what's at risk is being reduced in a lot of organizations. Supply chain disruptions. I've found many organizations, they're having to work without necessary or critical parts or elements, chemicals that they might need. So in some areas, it's leading to out of scope work or out of process work taking place. With these four things I've talked about, what I found is many observations in many different industries of work occurring incongruent to the standard. So this normalization of deviance is becoming more often observed across multiple industries and locations and companies within this industries. And what that means is not performing the work according to the standard and how it's supposed to be planned is becoming the norm in several areas. The oversight has been decreasing, the time on the floor, the time on the field, and even leadership tenure decreasing. In several organizations, I'm seeing the supervisors, some in management, moved around or brought in without the technical understanding of how that work is being performed. And then some more concerning things within America, at least, that there's been a heightened amount of anxiety. It's really tragic to hear that the suicide rate has been increasing over the last 10 years. But with that, a growing concern about mental health and the need for creating psychological safety. But also with these things, a lot of leaders have told me, again, across a lot of different places, that they're concerned about their term triggering somebody, upsetting somebody. So I'm hearing more instances of leaders not stopping work that they see dangerous, not approaching and having a conversation for fear of it being perceived as confrontation and the pushback they may receive. So without the skills and the confidence, people aren't stopping the work and aren't saying things that they see as concerning. And then finally, the last few, that the incident rate has been trending downward over the last 10 years, but unfortunately the fatality rate is trending upward. I've also seen few of organizations reducing their production needs, their yield that's required, or their productivity targets to match the situation, the new playing field that they're on right now with the decreased workforce and the decreased cultural capacity that I'll talk about today. And then finally, one of the things that I'm seeing in many organizations, which reinforces why we need to take a look at how we're approaching things, is very often when I look at corrective action plans, what an organization's doing, either if it's preventative action plans, but most often after an event or after an audit. And if I look at those corrective action plans, while there's often a layered approach to addressing hazards and risks in an organization, but if you start to measure those corrective action plans against the hierarchy of controls, elimination, substitution, engineering, notification, training, policies, procedures, and personal protective equipment. If you look at the hierarchy of controls compared to the corrective actions, very often I'm finding that a lot of it is putting more paperwork and PPE on people. And when we're relying on a lot of administrative controls and PPE with a less experienced workforce, with new people training new people, we're creating an opportunity for error-likely situations. In medicine, there's a mantra that's used in a lot of different aspects of medicine: early detection, early response. If we can detect things early, we can respond. If we are not finding them until after something's happened, then we react. Think about if your body responds to a transplant, a procedure, an intervention, that's good. If it reacts, that's not a good situation to be in. So can we detect some of these things? Can we identify where we're at? Not just look at our performance and say we're good. Are other things going on that might be cracking this bridge that we've created? So let's get into this bridge concept. Originally created again in 2008 by my former business partner, now retired, Terry Mathis, for those of you that are joining. So the bridge represents moving towards what you want, moving towards excellence. And again, how we've defined excellence has just continued to evolve over the years. And looking at where we're at today. Now, I find a lot of organizations have moved past the mindset about targeting zero injuries and zero injuries. The reason is, and this is a bit flippant, so if you'll allow me, I've worked in so many organizations the last couple of decades, and I find that there are really three paths to take you to zero injuries. And see if this resonates with what you've seen in your own experiences. Number one, don't report the events. Unethical, illegal in a lot of areas. But if injuries are being suppressed, if things are not being reported, that's one way to get you to zero injuries, not the right way. The second way is to be just continuously lucky all the time. And the third way, which is much more effective but much more difficult, is collective intentionality. And that's we're doing the right things moment by moment, minute by minute, hour by hour. And that is the hardest part. But if we're arriving accidentally at zero injuries, how do we know how to repeat it? So we have to continue to evolve this goal. When we're looking at excellence and safety, it's not just the ability to achieve and repeat great results. That's one of it. Of course, we want no injuries. Don't get me wrong. We want no injuries to occur, but that is only one part of how excellence needs to be defined in an organization. The second part is having insight, knowing precisely how we've arrived at zero injuries for that day, for that month, for that year. If we have great performance in any aspect of business and can't point to what's making that a reality, we're relying on too much luck. We need to work to manage the luck out of the equation. But we also have to create system capacity. We have to have confidence in our systems that we've put the right preventative measures in place. But we also have to realize you can't prevent everything from occurring. You can't. You also can't prevent all mistakes from being made. Mistakes are normal in complex environments. People will make mistakes. Every one of us in this discussion today will make several mistakes today. Most of them will be very minor and nothing bad happens. But we have to have recovery systems in place that if a mistake is made, somebody unintentionally does something, then we can help recover as well. So do we have confidence in our safety systems that we put in place? And then finally, all progress begins by thinking differently. Have we created a mindset that's shared throughout the organization that regardless of how well we're doing, we can always be better? Some of my clients have discontinued using the term best practice in lieu of the term better practice. What their fear is, it's just terminology, but language shapes our culture. Their fear is if we adopt a best practice, we might stop looking for a better way. And there's always going to be a better way to do things. So several clients I work with internally benchmark against themselves. They internally go out and try to identify good but not so common ways to do things, better practices. Others do what we refer to as maintaining a someday file. They keep a file of the things they don't know how to address. They don't either have the capital or they don't have the know-how. And periodically, they'll dust off that someday file and look at it. And maybe there's been some advancements. There's new people with new thinking that have joined the organization. And sometimes we can take some of those things off the someday file, but they never accept good as good enough. But they also realize, like Voltaire said, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We're not striving for perfection here. We're striving for excellence, which means we continuously investigate why things are going right. We celebrate those successes, but we work to understand why we have those successes. We're constantly referring back to our systems. Do we have the right things in place? That top 10 that I listed, your systems may need to change in order to adapt to a new plant, a new environment, a new workforce that you have today. I think it was Drucker that said your organizational systems are perfectly designed to give you the results you're currently receiving. And this is why those systems, safety is just a symptom of that. So when I look at this, when I'm looking at organizations, I've looked at more strategy than anyone when it comes to safety. And I find there's 10 areas you need to look at. If we're going to bridge this gap, if we're going to get to where we're trying to go, we need to make sure that we have excellence in these categories. And it's extremely difficult to be great and put the right amount of time and energy in each one of these at the same time. This is why organizations need a long-term strategy, not just action plans for a year. But from a compliance standpoint, even compliance is often changing, whether it's federal, state. The clients that you work with may change some things that they want you to comply with. But where are you with compliance? And as I walk you through this model here, maybe take this if you'd like, and I have an article on it and I can share any of these concepts here. Take it within your organization, have a discussion. Of these 10 items, what do you feel are our top 3 that we need to be great at over the next year? Where do we need to focus energy that's going to be game changing and get us further towards our definition of what excellence is? How are we on capital? How is money allocated? How are resources allocated? Do you have the right span of control invested in and span of influence? And that's allocation of safety resources to match the reality or the maturity that's needed. How is money freed up for the investment and continuous improvement? Culture, we'll spend a lot of time on culture here today, one particular model. So I'll come back to that. But culture is why we do what we do, not just what's common among a group. Academically, it's beliefs that govern behavior, but it's why we do what we do. Where are we on culture? Do we have a culture that's going to get us to where we're going? Or has our culture been reduced based on some of those things I've already identified? Complete person. This has to do with mental health. This has to do with psychological safety, but it also has to do with nutrition. Are we encouraging the right diet even for the people that we work with? A lot of studies show having the right diet leads to less cognitive fog for knowledge workers, but also leads to better productivity for workers that are using more of their hands. In Australia, I was in Australia last year, and I learned working with some organizations that in 2019, the Australian government, from what I can see, is the first one that now has requirements around psychological safety. There are things you have to put in place. Canada has a standard. One of my clients is implementing against that standard. England has a standard. And as of 2021, there's an ISO 45003 standard. So for all those of us in America, my prediction is we're going to see more about that over the next 10 years coming from our own federal government. But are we considering the complete person? Captured insight. How are we looking at our data? Do we have holes in our data collection strategy? Do our data tell us this is where we need to focus? It's on Wednesdays in this area with 0 to 2 year employees performing this task. Improving safety is nebulous. It's way too big. It's a blur phrase. Improve safety. What aspects? Where? What do we need to focus on? With whom? What systems do we need to shore up? Confidence in our system capacity. This is what we've talked about already. The preventative and the recovery considerations. Contractor safety management, sponsored here by Avetta. Are we doing the right things to set the right expectations, bringing contractors in? Are we aligning cultures, not just programs, and making sure they have the right rate there? So much more than that. Do we have the right type of oversight? Are we learning from each other? And even the final, most important, but often forgotten post-job. How did this go? What did we learn from it? How are we managing contractor safety? Competency and EHS technical acumen. By that, do our safety professionals and those that are making operational decisions have the right technical knowledge they need to successfully produce that product or service? Do they have the right technical know-how? Also on top of that is the competency with leadership acumen. My coach book I mentioned, the reason I wrote that is I find the most important person to shape performance in any category of operations is the most undertrained, under-resourced, underutilized person in the organization, that frontline supervisor. But their behavior is a byproduct of the person to whom they report and all the way back up in the organization. Are we skilling our leaders up with the right competencies and confidence to be the leaders we need to get more out of people, to address that disengagement we discussed earlier? And then finally, workplace conditions, which is where we typically start from 1970, the Hodge Act, focusing on the workplace conditions. Where are we at with that? Now, 10 things to consider, all wildly important. What are your top 3 that if you focused on would help close this gap? But what I find, and the topic of today that I'm going to sprinkle throughout the rest of the conversation, is you have to have these 5 core capacities to truly sustain excellence, whether it's safety performance, quality, whatever it might be. We have to have the system capacity, which is what we've talked about. You have to have leadership capacity. By that, I mean, we're aligning people to the systems, but we're also proactively embracing deviations from those system expectations or deviations from how the work is supposed to go or as planned. So have we established the leadership capacity, which is about influence and understanding and listening? Do we have leadership capacity? Do we have engagement capacity? What are we doing to create a motivated environment? You can't motivate another human being. It's intrinsic. You can do some extrinsic things to try to motivate them, but motivation is internal. Are we creating an environment where people want to go above and beyond? And I'll talk more about engagement. And then, are we creating the cultural capacity? And that would be described as what people do when the boss isn't around. 2 o'clock in the afternoon when just 2 people are working together, 2 o'clock in the morning. What gets reinforced in the absence of leadership? Are the culture looking out for the new tribe that's coming into the organization? Or has that tribe been outgrown by new people and we don't have that cultural capacity anymore? And then finally, strategic capacity. We have to have a strategy, and a strategy is not just failing less. A strategy defines what success is. So here's a way to do this that I lead in workshops and engagements with leadership. If you want to define success and safety, there will, at least for the next 10, 15 years, still be a results component to it. And of course, that's important. But we also have to define it by culturally. So I call this the Olympics analogy. I learned a couple of Olympics ago what was happening when social media became ubiquitous. The countries around the world had always been chasing the medal count. We tend to hear who medals in an event. Now with social media, you definitely hear who medals in an event before you watch that event. I remember the Summer Olympics two Summer Olympics ago. I'm from Houston, Texas. I was happy to cheer on Simone Biles from the United States Olympics gymnastic team. And I remember being at a Hilton in St. Louis, and Facebook got in a little trouble at the time for the United States community users, because if you opened up Facebook, they pushed across the platform in the US that the United States gymnastics team had captured the gold. I was upset. I wanted to watch it. I wanted to cheer on Simone Biles and team. But because, why I call it the Olympics analogy, because we tend to hear who medals in an event, later that day, if you watch that event, you tend to say to yourself, that's why they got the gold, or that's why they got the silver, because you could see the performance that led to the result. We all want the result. We want that gold medal, but how clearly have we defined what performance is going to get us there? So success can't be just in results term. It also has to be in performance and even behavioral term. I'm not talking about behavior-based safety, I'm talking about behavioral. And the reason for that is we humans, think about this in even your own personal life. Last time you had an argument with someone, we humans do a much better job aligning other humans to our results expectations than we do our behavioral expectations. And in psychology, we learn that all disappointment is based on a set level of expectations. So we're upset because our expectations weren't being met, but often we only clearly communicated the outcome we wanted, not what it takes to arrive at that outcome. That's why we need a strategy with a handful, no more than, strategic priorities that we're going to focus on over the next 3, 4, 5 years to execute on how we're going to close this gap. What are we going to focus on? But a strategy also has to tell us what we're not going to do. And your strategy, based on my opening comments, safety excellence and business excellence, your safety strategy has to be a part of the business strategy. If it's not, it will conflict. And if it's a dichotomous safety thing or production or business thing, which one do you think is going to win? The business. So business leaders need to be a part of the creation and own the execution of the safety strategy. If safety truly is to become a core value, not just a situational value, it has to be operationalized in line leadership. Safety can still be the figure person of it and can own some of the aspects of it, but I've looked at hundreds of strategic framework strategies, and my trigger is when I see more than 30% owned by safety or EHS group. That's when I start to get concerned that safety owns too much of it. But we also have to have different types of measurements. And most companies, leading indicators become measurements of activities. And the problem with that is we fall into the correlation causation trap. It sounds like this: we're doing these things, we had better results, therefore we had better results because we're doing these things. Maybe, maybe not. I've seen some terrible examples of the horrible things a company was doing to their workforce, and they still got improved performance. So it's not a matter of failing less, and it's not a matter of just doing more. We have to determine what's creating value, because strategy is about value creation. It's not about failing less. In our STEPS book that we wrote, published in 2013, we introduced a model called the perpetual cycle of avoiding failure. And it sounded like this. See if this resonates with any of you in your careers. Number one, we look at our incident rate. Number two, we set a new incident rate goal or objective. Number three, we develop a list of things to do. Number four, we do those things. Then we look at our incident rate. How do we do? Now, again, the problem is when we have improved performance, we think it's because we were doing that. So let's go do more of it. And more becomes the mentality versus better. And a lot of organizations, not everyone, but in a lot of organizations, they have the right amount of energy and effort applied towards safety. They just need to be better focused, not throw more at it. And that's why we need a strategy. It's not a matter of just throwing more programs at problems and hope things are going to go away. So let me introduce you to what I've seen that's happened and what is a bridge. Your organization is that bridge, you as well, what we've been doing over the years, what we need to focus on. The first pillar of support here in the United States, really concentrated on in the 1970s, was management and compliance. That's the first rule. We have to maintain our license to operate. We have to make sure we're doing things that are legal and ethical in order to maintain our business. So that's the first thing. And we need to have management of that. And with this, in order to support it, we have to have rules. And with those rules, we have to have enforcement of those rules. But enforcing the rules doesn't mean just saying something when someone disobeys. How we come across when we're enforcing the rules is wildly important, especially for all the new people that are coming into the organization. These new people are being exposed to a lot of things that are different than where they came from. Even if they worked for competition down the road, you have different rules, you have different ways of things that need to be done. And according to Maurer, there are three things that trigger people to resist change. Number one, they don't understand it. Number two, they don't like it. Number three, they don't like who's bringing it. Those last two highlight people respond emotionally before they respond logically. So we have to address that when we're introducing even the rules, but we also have to explain the why. In a lot of industries, a lot of organizations, and some branches of the military use this saying that rules are written in blood. The reason why we have those things is because bad things happened and maybe we don't have the capacity to engineer it out. So we've created some of those rules. But as we're enforcing the rules, we have to be cognizant about how we come across. If we come across and enforcing the rules that we're out there to catch people heavy-handed and discipline, it may change behavior, but it may create more avoidance behavior. People get better at not getting caught. And that's not the goal. Our goal is not to go out there and help people avoid situations. But with this initial approach, a lot of it has to do with making sure we don't fail and managing that failure rate, if you will. But think about when this is our approach, very immature in the path towards safety excellence and building this bridge. When this is our approach, think about what that does from a motivational perspective. All right, folks, the recording of this is May 18th. I want you to work harder to fail less the rest of the year. Not very motivating, but that's kind of the message that it sends. Don't have a failure. And remember, People make mistakes all the time. So that can lead to people not wanting to report those mistakes. And we start having deviations and we don't talk about those things, and then bad things occur later. But we also realize the limitation of this in safety. While this pillar is important, it only takes us partially across. And with all the changes that we talked about in the opening of this bridge can come down. So as you're thinking about this bridge and where you're at as I'm walking you through this, be thinking about what aspect of focus on could make the biggest difference and what do we maybe need to go back and maintain. Because it's not a matter of creating it and then going away. There's things that are constantly changing, constantly happening that could disrupt the efficacy, the structural integrity, if you will, of this bridge. But we realize this limitation when we answer this question. Can employees obey all the rules, follow all the procedures, wear all their personal protective equipment, and still get injured? Of course they can. So it only takes us partially across. Well, since the Challenger and Chernobyl events in 1986, we've been focusing heavily on the safety culture and involving people. One of my favorite quotes from W. Edwards Deming that's really served me well is people support what they help to create. People support what they help to create. So we need to involve people. It's not a matter of doing safety for them. We have to involve them. And our strategy cannot just be about injury and incident prevention. That's where most focus, understandably. But if you're not also trying to create the culture that you want, it's never going to be permanent. It's never going to be sustainable performance. The culture is critically important. And by the way, there's no such thing as a safety culture, but everyone has one. Safety culture is just a part of your occupational culture. When people join your organization, they have existing experiences and perceptions. Even somebody that's new into your location that doesn't understand the basics of righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, they have some sort of perceptions, or they don't know or perceive what is risky yet. So those perceptions impact their attitudes. I mentioned stop work authority, so I like using that one as an example. That if I think it's a good idea to exercise stop work authority, I'm going to make a different decision than if I think that's a bad idea. When I act on that decision, I have an expectation of what's going to occur. And the experience I have, we all talk to ourselves, it's called self-talk. The experience that I have tells me whether I should continue to do that or not. It sounds like, oh, I'm never doing that again. Or, hey, that turned out a lot better than I thought. Now, people are dropped right in the middle of this model, and they're exposed by the things that they see, the things that they hear. And whoever has the loudest voice is shaping the storytelling within a crew, within a shift, or within an organization, especially if those people are influential. So we need to be intentional when we're creating the culture that we want. What do we want people to believe? What beliefs, if became common, would be game-changing for the organization? And this goes back to defining success. Some organizations culturally will define it by the top 5 beliefs and the top 5 behaviors. One client of mine across all of their plants, part of how they define success was several years ago, we started this, and it was called 5 by 5 by 25. We will be successful in the year 2025 when these 5 beliefs and these 5 behaviors become common. That was part of how they defined success. And then they had very carefully chosen initiatives year by year on what they're going to do to make sure we're giving people the right experiences and the right stories are being told. Because if we don't monitor to the best of our ability the experiences people have and the stories that are being told, we will be managed by the perceptions that are created. So culture is a byproduct, but we have to look at what's creating that byproduct. But even more broadly than that, every one of us in this discussion today has our own perceptual filters. How we were raised, how we were brought up, where we live, what we identify with, all of those things make us unique, and you pull together a unique group of individuals that shapes that culture. But while you have the occupational culture, every organization, whether they want to admit it or not, has multiple cultures within. Here's a thought exercise for you. Think about if you're at a plant, or if you're over a crew, or if you have broader responsibilities. How many supervisors do you have in your organization? Just ballpark it. Think about it. Is it 20? Is it 2? Is it 200, 2,000? My argument is, however many supervisors you have, that's a good way to judge how many different cultures you have, because you have cultures within cultures. Department night shift is often a different culture than day shift, not because of their supervisor, because that's just the reality. Less oversight. Certain types of people like to work night shifts, certain types of people don't, so they're disgruntled sometimes. You have different cultures within an organization, and you reach a point of diminished returns when we're going about this bridge to excellence, just trying to create a culture of safety excellence. Because if people have these desirable experiences with how they're interacting with regards to safety, but they don't have it in their larger day-to-day interactions with the people they report to and peers and others, you may improve the safety culture, but you're not going to improve the overall culture. So this needs to be a business culture, an occupational culture approach, not just a safety culture. So with the culture, you have to have some things to stabilize this as well. And that's focus. And then you have to have reinforcement of that focus. A lot of companies do what I call focusing on safety. What they need is to focus in safety. When we say things like think safety, target zero, all of that, safety is most important. Safety is a value, safe production, whatever term you want to use, that's focusing on the topic. Specificity is needed. What is the most important thing somebody needs to know to prevent the stuff that could kill them? What is the most important thing with the work they do that needs to prevent the low probability risks, the things that are taking place hundreds of times, but if the dice are rolled, it can turn out wrong one time. So you have serious injury fatality types of exposure, and you need to have a strategy to identify and address those, but you also have to have it on the low probability side. Everybody is focusing on something. No one's coming to work trying to get injured. They're trying to get the job done. What happens often is it's unintentional. They don't mean to do what they're doing. Sometimes they meant to be doing what they were doing and it turned out the wrong way. They're not meaning to try to get injured. So what are people focusing on and what's being reinforced in the absence of those that can do the enforcement? Have you developed good reinforcement mechanisms? And this is that cultural capacity I talked about earlier. Now, with this, we have to focus on leadership because this is about influencing performance, about encouraging people to go above and beyond, not just do the minimal necessary to get by. Have we created the leadership capacity in our organization? Are your leaders doing a lot more coaching for performance than just managing for compliance? We have an approach, a very successful engagement called leadership safety coaching that we spent a very participative day on helping leaders develop these skills and then develop some commitments and then some accountability mechanisms afterwards. But we have to have our leaders on the floor, in the field, observing and giving feedback and removing obstacles and barriers. That's what coaching is. First, you have to familiarize. You have to know your individuals, what makes them tick, what motivates them, what demotivates them. Even in the right setting, most importantly, who's important to them? What are their family members? Knowing these individuals is important. I'll give you an example. A power distribution organization, we were rolling out this leadership safety coaching to all of their people leaders, so hundreds and hundreds of people. I heard some phenomenal stories that still sit with me. And one story was an individual that was on a line crew. So he's in a bucket working on overhead high voltage lines. And he told me the story that 20 or so years ago, he was going through a pretty nasty divorce. It was pretty tumultuous. And his supervisor knew what he was going through and made the call to pull him out of that bucket for 3 weeks to not do that work. And he told me during that time, he used an expletive, but I'll be nice and say he was mad. But he also told me he now knows that that supervisor saved his life because he made a difficult call to not allow him to do that work that day because his mind wasn't in the right place. And we've talked about mental health, the unfortunate increase in suicide in America. You've got to know your people. Then you got to know, what do you want to focus them on? How do you want to help your people perform to the best of their abilities? That's what coaching is. I still see in some organizations, because I do a lot of assessments and helping them develop their plans, I see in a lot of organizations that coaching is a term that's used for the first step in discipline. If that's how your company pursues that, I'm sorry, but you've got it wrong. Coaching is not a disciplinary tool. Coaching is about helping your people perform to the best of their ability every time, everywhere. So you have to coach for performance. You can't coach for results. You have to be clear about what's the performance we want. Then are we giving the right types of feedback, which is to encourage effective future performance? And then how do we facilitate? How do we make it easy by addressing the systems, the environment, the tool and the equipment? How do we make it easy for our people to be successful? Then we have to work on building trust. Trust is the glue that keeps a relationship together, that keeps teams of teams together, that keeps a culture together. And one of the formulas a friend of mine introduced me to on how you build trust in relationships is what's called CB over T, consistent behavior over time. That's how you establish trust. So our leaders, our supervisors, our employees behaving consistently over time to establish that trust. And then with that, you get the sense of teamwork. In my first corporate career after the military, somebody on one of my crews shared with me that teamwork means we're all in this together. We're not going to allow each other to fail. So are we creating a real sense of we're all in this together? We're watching out for each other, truly being that brothers and sisters keeper. But with all of this, we have to remember, yes, we want to put all the preventative systems in place that we can, but people make mistakes. Things happen. Do we have recovery systems? Do we have even AEDs accessible everywhere? I heard just the last couple of weeks, 2 examples of deaths that occurred to 2 individuals, both by bee stings. And neither one of those individuals, unfortunately, had an EpiPen with them when they were stung and did not make it to the hospital. An EpiPen even is a type of recovery system. But there's mechanical recovery systems, there's electronic, there's physical, but there's also training your individuals in what to do and how to respond if something goes wrong. And a lot of organizations, many of their events come from when there's an upset condition. And most of the training is on how to work that equipment when things are going well. They don't do enough training and drills on what to do when things don't go to plan. And sometimes that's an issue. And then finally, we want to create that sense of engagement. And engagement is 3.5 things. Number 1, buy-in. You can't expect somebody to buy into something until they've had the opportunity to weigh in on that something. The next one is willing participation, not just checking a box, doing it because they have to. They're willing to participate in whatever these activities are that we're asking them to be engaged in. Finally, it's ownership. And then the 0.5 is shared ownership, where we all have a shared ownership of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're going to go about it. That's what real engagement is. So with this, I want to share another perspective that will hopefully help you identify why all of this is so important. And I call this the capacity for sustainable excellence. Work is delegated in all organizations. There's people at the top, there's people right at the front line, that first line supervisor that's out there to direct the work. Now, organizations build their culture, the values, the way decisions are made inside and outside of the organization. Since 1986, been more intentional about the safety culture. But as I've mentioned, that's just a part of the occupational culture, and there's culture within culture. So what we've done is we put in the first preventative systems. We want to make sure we can stop bad things from occurring. Well, supervisors are out there and they develop how the work should go. And we have standards, we have work instructions. This is how the work should be performed. The reality is every day, all over the place, there are deviations that are occurring from that. And often we don't really learn about those deviations because we're not embracing the deviations. We're not seeking out those weak signals. So we often learn about those deviations when a tragedy occurs, an injury, a major quality issue, hurting consumers, not just employees. When that happens, we have to have recovery systems to bring the organization back to the state, the environment back to the state, or like EpiPen, minimize the resulting severity of this. So do we have system capacity to prevent and recover? With all the things we've been talking about, have we created leadership capacity? And that's to align people to those standards, but also realize sometimes the standards might be wrong. are we having deviations, and are we intentionally, proactively seeking out those blue line conversations to we're creating an environment where it's safe to talk about things didn't go as planned, or you have a concern about how things are going and you don't have any data that supports it, but we still want to talk about this. The opposite of this is normalization of deviance, where it's normal to deviate from the standard, and that's what everybody is focusing on. So have we established leadership capacity? You have to have the system capacity where practical and possible, but if you don't have the leadership capacity, then anything goes in an organization. And you can't get that final piece until you have the leadership capacity piece. And that's the cultural capacity. That's how we're indoctrinating new people into the tribe. We're watching out for them. We're passing on the institutional knowledge. We're making sure the risks we never take are passed on to an organization. Last year, I'll give you an example of this. A plant of mine I've worked with for years. They're really good in safety. They do a lot of great stuff, and they've had a really strong tribe that looks out for each other. Not a lot of attrition, not a lot of turnover. And then COVID happened. And then all of a sudden, 30, 40% attrition, lots of changes in the organization. And the plant manager pulled me aside during one of my visits and said, Shawn, I couldn't believe it. I caught a new employee ducking underneath the line. Now, in this particular process, you can't guard the line because for different batches, they have to make movements and move things around. But as products coming across, everybody knows you never duck underneath that line. It's a risk we never take. Well, as the plant manager and I were talking through this, we found no one ever talked to that new employee about this risk we never take because they took it for granted. They didn't even need to talk about it anymore because it's cultural. We all know that. Unfortunately, that was taken for granted and it wasn't passed on to that individual. And she made a mistake, not realizing that's just not the way we do things around here. So we have to establish that cultural capacity. But to get us all the way across each one of these aspects within building your bridge is important. And they change in importance over time, which is why we have to maintain this bridge. We have to be looking out for some of these disruptors, things that are changing the playing field, and we may need to change how we're approaching this game. So it's not a matter of just building this bridge to sustainable performance. It's a matter of monitoring and making sure we're doing the right things. I hope this has been helpful. I'm thankful for Avetta for inviting me to give this talk and share some of the concepts within my new book that was just published this week. So I'm going to turn it back over to see if we have any time for questions and see if I might be able to provide any more resources. A lot of the things we've talked about, not just the book, you can find on our website, podcasts, articles, videos, a tremendous amount of content. But if you want to contact me directly for anything that I've talked to, and if there's something I can share, I'd be more than happy to do so. So back to you all.
All right. Well, excellent, Shawn. Thank you and great job. We appreciate you sharing your insights and your expertise. Before we do start the Q&A, just want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after the webinar. We appreciate your input as it's very important to helping us improve our future webcasts. Again, if you'd like to ask Shawn a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button to submit. If we don't get to your question today, all unanswered questions will be forwarded along to Shawn. And with that, we'll get started with the Q&A. To start, Shawn, in your experience, how can the company's culture affect trying to cross the bridge?
Well, it can affect it in a lot of different ways, and it can change. In the book, I gave an example of Ira new hire, and she's a person that joins the organization, and she's come from a place where safety was really important. And she comes and she's sitting at lunch and she hears an example about an employee that's no longer with the company named Steven. This is a fictitious example, named Steven, that did stop work one time and got in a little bit of trouble from the supervisor and now no longer works there. Now, whether that story is true or not, we all fall into the trap of confirmation bias. We think we have a belief about something and we're biased to look for evidence that proves that belief. So that seed's now been planted. Now, unfortunately, Ira sees a situation to where we've asked her, hey, if you see this, stop work. She does. The supervisor immediately runs over, turns the machine back on, and starts to probe why she shut that machine down, and got a little bit of a talking to. Now she has that experience. She now shares that with people at lunch, and now that story becomes viral in the organization. So your culture is changing all the time, and it changes with the day-to-day experiences. So I'd also like to share that my belief is safety is both global and local. When you have a strategy, when you have plans, we want to implement initiatives across the organization, that's global. But your culture stays the same or changes in the day-to-day interactions and experiences they have with others and the bosses in the organization. So your culture can be the most effective sustainability mechanism when we've been intentional about the culture that we want, and we're constantly monitoring, are people having the right experiences and the right stories being told when they act on the desired beliefs and behaviors. If we don't monitor that, then we can't, then again, we're going to be managed by those perceptions. And I have a couple of clients that they interesting keep what they call a misperception list, and they're looking for those things that might become rumor mill, and then they proactively, well, I guess reactively, go out and try to address those misperceptions. So Ken, I hope I'm answering your, I'm sorry, it was another person. I hope I've answered that question. Your culture can be, can be a tool. It can really help you get there, or it can also be a tool to keep you where you're at today. And it's not the workers to blame for this. The workers are a part of the culture, but so is the CEO, so is the supervisor.
All righty, thank you. This next question comes from Ken, and he asks, it says that I like this coaching for performance concept. And could you please give a quick example of how you'd help workers understand the coaching for performance versus results situations?
Okay, well, again, another shameless plug. Find my book, Coach, A Safety Leadership Fable. No, so here's what. If you look at what does an injury-free outcome look like? What does a safe day look like? That's a result. Going home with our 10 fingers, 10 toes that we all came in. But what is the most important thing we need to focus on to make that a reality? Is it stop work authority? So if people are stopping work, what happens if they do it, and what happens if they don't? If you're going to shape performance in another person, you have to be able to answer 4 questions. What do you want that person to do? And that's where it has to be behaviorally defined. Now, sometimes companies will use tools like behavior-based safety, and whether they use it correctly or not, and they integrate concepts from human and organizational performance as well. But at the end of the day, we want to define, this is what we need to do. When for climbing up and down ladders, maintaining 3 points of contact is a behavior. Safe ladder usage is a result. So can we define precisely what is that performance? Go watch sports. Look at how those performers perform. The coaches focus on that performance. Yep. When you're swinging, keep your elbow up there. My sister was an equestrian hunter jumper trainer for a long time, and I was always impressed with her coaching. I would stand there. I prefer to ride Western, but that's her thing. Keep your heels down. Yep, that's it. Do that again. That's coaching for performance. The second question is, how do you get it out of your head and into their heads? You want some of this stuff to become habitual, and it's never going to create a new habit unless you go through the head first to get to the subconscious. But then on the coaching piece, you have to have answers to what happens if they do it and what happens if they don't. That's a balance of consequences. And if you don't have that balance of consequences, we're not shaping performance. So just as much is needed. Ken, that's exactly how to do that. When you approach that project, doing that right there, that's exactly what happened. Or Ken, we've discussed this is how we want to approach it, and I see that we're not. Let's, can we talk about this? Is there a reason why? Coaches help their people perform to the best of their ability. So I hope that's been helpful.
All right, it looks like we've got time for one more question today. And it asks, what is the best strategy once you realize there is deviation from the standard?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's a singular strategy. It goes back to looking at training and oversight and assessments of competency. If we have a deviation from the standard, whether we're leveraging learning teams, we're bringing different people in to try to understand that. The first approach is, if we identify a deviation, especially if somebody has brought it forward, we need to thank them. We need to make sure that they feel, it's called reinforcing the buy-in decision, that they feel it's a good idea to do that. But when we're having deviations, we have to understand what's leading to that. It's often not just an employee that's making a mistake there. That happens. That certainly can happen. But what if the replacement tested? Is it trying to remember who James Reason's culpability model is a good one to look at. If you take an employee out and put another one in, might they be influenced to deviate from that same standard? I was at a group last week, and most of what we would call work instructions were out of date or weren't easily available. If you haven't performed that task in a few months, you're kind of signed out. So there was no standard to even assess, to even measure your activity against. So the best strategy is to thank the person that's identifying it, because we want those signals to be strong, but also work to understand what's leading to those deviation. Is it a bad standard, poorly written, not trained upon? That gets into deeper issues, which is why my initial hesitation on what the strategy is, because sometimes the business is in a survival mode. They have to bring so many new people in, and they don't have the capacity to put the leaders in place. So we have to look at this, and another strategy is say, is this acceptable? Is how we're approaching this as a business acceptable? Is our goal still excellence and safety, or just try to incrementally get a little bit better than the bad position that we're in? And that has to be an operational decision, because it's the operational leadership who are hiring those people, not the safety leadership. So are we bringing the right people in, and are we setting them up for success? If it's a constant deviation, that's an organizational issue. That's not just a safety issue. So we need to look at it like an organizational opportunity, not just a safety opportunity.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today. Sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded along to Shawn. Once again, we hope that you take the time to fill out that forthcoming evaluation survey and give us your feedback. With that, we end today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Shawn Galloway, everyone at Avetta, and all of you who listened in. Thanks, and have a great day.